Hi, sorry to interrupt your viewing. However, I'd just like to let you know about my counselling service, which is available online or in person if you're near us, to support you with the kinds of issues that we're talking about on my channel. So if you are affected by any of these issues, please get in touch because we can help you. We also work with narcissistic abuse, coercive control, loss, grief and bereavement, life transitions, careers, anxiety and low mood, depression, self-doubt, people-pleasing and struggling with boundaries, relationship difficulties, work stress and burnout and addiction, and self-medicating patterns. If you're looking for support with any of those things, please get in touch. You can book an appointment. The link is in the description and in my profile. Thanks for watching. And now back to the video that you came to watch. So, hello. So today we're joined by Tanya. Tanya, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. My name's Tanya De Grunwald, and I am a podcaster. I run a podcast called This Isn't Working, which is all about the world of work. And I'm investigating all sorts of things that have gone disastrously wrong. And I think your listeners will be aware of some of them. So yeah, looking forward to getting into that today.
Yeah, it was like a breath of fresh air when I found your podcast because it's all about what's happening in the workplace, and that's like a big part of what's going wrong, isn't it? In the workplace, that's where the fear for women is.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's all sorts of stuff that's gone wrong all at the same time, but actually it looks like it's gone wrong overnight, but actually I think the more I look into it, it's actually things that have been kind of building for maybe 10, maybe more years. So maybe up to 20 years, maybe even more. And in different industries, you see different things that have gone slightly differently wrong. So
Yeah.
I'm looking at things like culture and leadership and recruitment and young people. Obviously, the dreaded diversity, equity and inclusion, DEI, is what's come up as being a spectacular fail, or at least, was it ever a good idea? If it was, it seems to have gone off the rails.
I think
There's all sorts
so,
of stuff that's
yeah.
kind of happening and it's all kind of coalescing at the same time, but trying to dig into the different aspects of it, I think it's actually really complicated and really fascinating. And I think people are dismissing it as being just a bunch of activists who came in and just kind of trashed all these organizations. But in fact, what I'm learning is there is plenty of blame to go around at all levels and in all departments, in all different ways.
Yeah, plenty of responsibility to be taken, lessons to be learned.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my background's in the voluntary sector, and so equality and diversity has been a big part of my career, and always believed in it. It was something that was a positive thing, that you wouldn't discriminate against someone who was different from you, and it was about equal opportunities. But that's kind of been corrupted, hasn't it? Like, it's now about equity and
Yeah, I think, I mean, it did all start with good intentions. I think a lot of people don't believe that, and that's up, that's their right to believe that. It does kind of make me laugh when I go on podcasts with lots of very academic people, all these sort of public intellectuals and academic types who've done their studies into how all this stuff is, got all these Marxist roots and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, I'm sure you guys are right, but I also think I am right in that actually what I'm seeing is a whole bunch of people who really aren't terribly bright, lots of them, and they had really good intentions. And this stuff didn't have any guardrails around it. They're not particularly political. They don't, I mean, it might be political with a small p, but they don't sit around kind of, quoting passages of these activist sort of texts and stuff. It's just not true. They actually sit around talking about themselves, frankly, and their own childhood and their own stuff and their own feelings. So I'm trying to challenge this idea that it's a sort of Marxist takeover, because I mean, it'd be interesting to hear more about your experiences in the charity sector, but my experience is more in the corporate world, and trying to convince me that everybody who works at Barclays and JP Morgan and all these huge organizations are like these mad activists. It's just not true. So something else has gone wrong. So what is it that's gone wrong?
Yeah, I think I got out before it happened. I've had my business for 10 years now, so
yeah,
back then when I left, it wasn't a thing.
Yeah. I mean, I know your listeners are particularly interested in what employers would call trans inclusion. And I've had Kate Barker from LGBT Alliance on, I've had Stella O'Malley from GenSpect. And I've also had Gareth Roberts on to talk about, does DEI have a misogyny problem, which is really interesting as well. So we are talking about that issue a lot. I think really because it has exposed an awful lot of rot. It's the thing that is bringing that to the surface. Probably also a kind of discussions around Israel and Palestine in the workplace as well. So those sorts of issues, but probably trans is the biggest example, well, those two together, of an issue which is not going to be resolved from like sitting around and having a chat about our differences. This is too fundamental. We need to find other ways around this, through this, to make sure that we've got, we all know, the line between your beliefs and my beliefs is exactly equidistant between us. Mine don't push onto you and yours don't push
Yeah.
onto me. And that's kind of where we've got wrong, is prioritizing some people's views and beliefs over other people's. And I think the trans thing is a really good example of that.
Can't see how Palestine and Israel has got a place in the workplace.
Well, if you're doing like bake sales for Gaza
I
and
suppose, yeah.
not thinking that that's some kind of statement which might make some people feel uncomfortable in the workplace, then I think you might need to take
Yeah.
another look at this again.
Yeah. See what you
So,
mean.
and it's, people being allowed to have sort of, flags and stickers and things on their computers, which some people might take as a kind of aggressive, like where, I think, I mean, flags have got us into all sorts of problems with the trans stuff as
Yeah.
well, and how things that seemed fairly innocuous can actually be problematic in terms of not only how it makes people feel, but also, there can be legal, I've understood a lot more about this, there can be legal implications to that, which is if you're letting people put these flags and stickers on everything and have all these events, if somebody takes you to an employment tribunal, then the fact that you've done all those things and allowed those things can allow their lawyers to present your workplace as being hostile to their client,
Yeah.
which is not going to help you in court.
Yeah.
So it's like this terrible word inclusion, which sounded so lovely. Who doesn't want to be inclusive? But it turns out, one person's idea of inclusion is someone else's idea of feeling excluded. And I think we haven't given enough thought to that.
Yeah, that's definitely apparent, and I think a lot of women and men who are following what's happening with trans ideology, they will understand the pronoun badges and the progress pride flags. They'll understand it from that perspective, but I hadn't considered about the kind of charity, kind of nice things that you do in the workplace.
Yeah,
Yeah,
lanyards. I mean, it's such a stupid thing, isn't it? But hanging that around someone's neck,
yeah.
it's
It
just
really annoys me when I get on the train and they've all got rainbow lanyards on. Not the rainbow ones particularly, but the Progress Pride ones.
yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it just sort of seems like such a small thing, but if you're not into that stuff, it sends a completely different message to the one that you
Mm,
probably think it's sending.
yeah,
So, and I just think, looking back on all this stuff, and it just sort of crept in a way that was like, there just didn't seem to be any problem with it. If unless you were really paying attention, there just didn't seem to be a problem with it. But almost that should have sort of set our alarm bells off, because this was quite big changes that were brought in. And it was like, what could be the problem with giving your pronouns just to show that you're being inclusive? Like, you had to, like, it's quite a big change to do that in meetings, or to
yeah.
put that on your, on your Zoom, you know, name or whatever. So maybe we should have thought something about this feels a bit funny,
But
but I don't know.
if you don't know a lot about the subject, you just think, well, what harm is it? Because
Yeah,
that's what I thought at first. But then as more and more people did it, I felt uncomfortable. And at first I was like, well, I don't need to do that because I'm a woman and it's obvious.
yeah,
Do you know what I mean? It's obvious what I am. I don't need to do that and I don't want to. And now everyone's doing it. I really don't want to do it because I don't like to jump onto bandwagons and what have you. But to actually challenge it, you have to know a little bit more about the harms.
yeah, yeah. And it's all to do with how it came in. I mean, I noticed that since we're talking about the trans stuff, I noticed that coming in around sort of 2017, 2018, 2019, and it just was presented as a kind of extension of what used to be called gay rights.
Yeah,
It was all, suddenly we're talking about LGBT. Everyone was talking about LGBT, and it sort of sounded modern and fresh and whatever. And they would have these events where there would be a panel, and there'd usually be young trans-identified people who, who were great. They were funny, they were enthusiastic, they were just the kind of people who you would want working in your organization. And they were asking for what seemed like fairly small accommodations. And so I guess maybe there might be some people in the audience going, I'm not sure I quite get this, but okay. And then who just didn't sort of think, what are the implications of this? There must be something more to it. Maybe there isn't. But I think looking back on it now with a different lens, I just think there just wasn't any sense that anything could be wrong with it, I think.
Yeah.
But looking back on it, I'm sure there were people who thought there's something wrong here. So what was different about trans was that this no debate thing came in immediately at the same time as the new ideas themselves. So that meant that if you did have questions about any of this or think, I'm not sure about some of this, I might just need to think this through. By the time you realized that something about it wasn't quite right, or at least there might be an alternative view of looking at this, it was too late, because no debate was so powerful in the end that it meant that you couldn't even say, hang on a minute, let's just think this through.
Was that actually said in the workplace? No debate? Because I have heard that said by, like, Stonewall had brought that in, but in the workplace, you're not allowed to ask questions. That in itself is a red flag.
I mean, I'm more thinking about the sort of events that I was going to where there were panels of trans-identified people. And it would certainly, if it wasn't said explicitly, it was certainly implied, and any question around that was absolutely unwelcome. And so that was sort of, and because everything was transphobia, and you were sort of like, well, not quite sure, whatever you said wasn't, there was this terrible fear of, well, that person asked a question and look what happened to her. She got yelled at and whatever, or just more likely to just be sort of shamed. But there was
That's
definitely a culture.
unprofessional.
Yeah, but there was a culture where those spaces are their own little. The dynamic within those spaces is quite strange in a way that's what kind of set off my alarm bells. Was that you've got all these people who believe in this one idea, which is gender identity, and that you can change sex or change gender, whatever you're saying. But the minute you don't believe that stuff, you're looking at something completely different. You're looking at a group of people who have all got very excited about this idea and have all really bought into it. And there's no space really for anybody to say, well, actually, I don't believe in this. So how do I fit in? And what are we even doing in this meeting? And why do I even need to be here hearing all this stuff? Because this is not my belief system. This is yours. So that had kind of gone, really.
Yeah. And I think it was one of your podcast episodes where, I'm not sure if it was you or one of your guests, had said that we need to be looking at the other people in the workplace who might have, their husband might have decided that they are now trans, they're now a woman, and they are facing this like monumental shift in their lives, and being at work's now reminding them of that, and that they're not allowed to talk about it. And
I've still never heard anybody talk about those groups.
The trans
The trans
widows and
widows
the detransitioners
and the children of transitioners. And I think, to be fair to them, HR people are not from another planet. They are pretty normal people generally. They were watching the same TV shows and the same movies and reading the same magazines as everyone else. It was Caitlyn Jenner, it was Hayley from Coronation Street, it was Conchita Wurst winning the Eurovision. All that sort of gender bendy stuff was all coming in. Orange is the New Black. And the way it was presented by the media did have a massive impact as well. So, nobody really thought about, Caitlyn Jenner's kind of ex-wife and the effect on the children and all that kind of stuff, because we still haven't heard that.
Yeah.
I still haven't heard them honestly say whether they're fine with this or not. Maybe they are, but it wasn't, so as far as they were concerned, this is like, oh, this is a thing that some people's dads decide that they're a woman later in their life and everyone just goes along with it. So, I do have some sympathy for the HR people in that respect.
Yeah.
Where I think it went wrong was at the minute they were realizing there was a problem, there was no mechanism for anyone to say, hang on, I think we might have got this a bit wrong. Or at least there's another way of looking at this that we haven't considered. I think that's kind of what happened really there. So, but yeah, I think, just going back to kind of the digging that I'm doing, because I'm trying to find out what's gone wrong in different industries as well and at different levels. So you can look at those kind of activists now, as I see, who were coming in doing those presentations, particularly Stonewall, but there were lots of others as well. And the employers really trusted Stonewall. They had an amazing reputation at that time, which was really well earned because, it was properly run. It was a really well run organization. The gay rights movement was brilliant. They did amazing work by getting people, really changing hearts and minds did a fabulous job. But it wasn't clear to employers that Stonewall's kind of goals had changed at that point. So they kind of went along with it. And I think that's really kind of how that was brought in, really. I don't know. I look back at it all differently now. I mean, I should explain. So most recently I've been running a club for good employers of young people. So it's called the Good and Fair Employers Club. And I started that in 2018. And my members were the head of early careers, which is the person who's in charge of the graduate schemes and the apprenticeships at lots of different big organizations. So I'd get them together and we'd all talk about, how you run one of these different schemes in a good way. And we did that all the way through COVID as well. And that was a real lifeline for them to talk to each other, because it's pretty difficult to run an apprenticeship scheme during a pandemic.
Yeah.
And you remember what it was like. So we were all on,
Yeah.
we were all online, we were all at home. So I learned a lot from them, and they were a great bunch of people. I kind of ran through some of their work, but they weren't DEI people. But I do remember that those DEI targets came in really quickly around 2020. So that was the kind of George Floyd period.
Yeah.
And that really supercharged everything. But the trans stuff was already there by that point, for sure. So yeah, so I was doing that, and I've had a bit of a ringside seat without realizing quite how significant that was going to turn out to be. Sort of seeing how DEI came into junior level recruitment, particularly. I'm less experienced at knowing what's gone on at senior level, although I'm learning that from the podcast. So I just interviewed a guy called Paul Sweeney, who's a corporate strategic advisor, who was talking about what went on in the board level for an episode called "Are Activist CEOs Out of Control?" And so he was talking about kind of senior level recruitment and how easy it is to do some pretty dodgy stuff, actually, because nobody knows that you never even interviewed any white people for the job or any men. You can actually get away with an awful lot, but actually junior level you can't really. And so they were pretty good, but they generally, like, they did all this stuff because they genuinely wanted a bigger talent pool to choose from. That was how DEI originally came in. It was called diversity and inclusion. The equity bit came later. And it was kind of about opening up opportunities. And they didn't want to just keep hiring the same middle class kids that went to private school, who they didn't even think were very good. They really genuinely wanted that diversity. And so I think when we started getting challenged from people saying, oh, anti-DEI, anti-woke, blah, 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 we were probably quite defensive, because the people that were doing like that sort of thing, so like kind of, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Suella Braverman, whether or not they had a point, because they did it in a way that clearly showed that they didn't really understand about things like pipeline and potential versus polish, and the massive advantage of having, parents in a professional job, for example, how confident you're going to feel going to an interview when you're used to that kind of situation. Because they didn't understand that, I think it was really easy for us to kind of dismiss that challenge as being just mean people who just didn't get it and didn't care.
Yeah.
So I think that was a mistake, that we didn't listen to that sooner, really. Yeah. So I mean, all sorts of things. I'm best known for naming and shaming big employers for having unpaid interns. So I named and shamed like Simon Cowell, Tony Blair, Philip Green, having unpaid interns. So I've always been on the side of young people. So again, I'm interested in the kind of youth aspect of what's happened here. And before that, I used to write for women's magazines. So I used to write for Glamour and Grazia and Cosmo and people. I used to write like dating stuff. And God, none of it's online, but all that kind of stuff. So I'm interested in women. I'm interested in young people. I'm interested in the world of work. So all of this stuff is right in the middle of my Venn diagram, basically.
Yeah. But it was so refreshing just to see someone in HR talking about this stuff, because, I've seen all the court cases, and from the sidelines looking in, you're like, how can this be happening? It's so obvious if you let men in women's spaces that they're not going to be very happy about it,
Yeah, I
and it
know.
just seems to have gone over people's heads. Like, and what are you seeing? How do you think that's
Yeah.
happened?
I mean, I think HR in a lot of ways is having a bit of an identity crisis. I think, I mean, their own industry body in the UK, it's called the CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, and I think the CIP just doesn't know what it's doing anymore either. I mean, they seem to think that their role is to make the world of work lovely for everybody, and their members, who are HR people, are like, no, we want you to support us, to give us materials and advice so that we can do a great job of running the people bit of this organization. And in the private sector, we need to make money here. And so
Yeah.
being everyone's friend is not necessarily compatible with we need to make money here and do what's best for the business. So
Yeah.
are we like so I think HR in losing its identity has probably attracted a lot of people, particularly women, who have that sort of caring kind of vibe to them. So it attracts a disproportionate number of those sorts of people who are looking to get something emotional, I think, from their role. And I think that's probably part of why we're seeing something like what we're seeing now, which is a sort of possibly misplaced empathy, or at least an inability to make sure that your empathy is equally and fairly distributed, let's say.
Yeah.
These are the sort of people who really want to be kind.
Yeah.
That's really, really important. So the minute you're attracting those sorts of people and you're not attracting hard-nosed business types who see people, human resources is a pretty horrible phrase, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
But your people are a big resource in an
Mm-hmm.
organization, and you can hire them, you can fire them. This is about making money. We're not running, a holiday camp here for everyone to just like love working here. Like, what do you do?
Yeah.
People work. We pay you some money.
Yeah.
You
Like,
do some work, and we'll pay you some money.
you
Like, what is
see
not clear
you
about
see
this?
people all the time talking, and this is going off on a tangent a little bit, but you see them all complaining about, oh, my employer doesn't want me to work from home, and do they realize how inconvenient that is? And I'm like, you are more productive when you go to to
Yeah,
work. And
yeah,
for any job, like, not all jobs are suitable to do at home, so really you're
yeah,
advocating for a very small proportion of the workforce to be able to work from home.
yeah. Working from home is another really good example of kind of the sort of ideas that sort of sneaked in. And, the other one, of course, is bring your whole self to work, which is just like a little tiny phrase, but it's a hell of a big idea, right? And it's like, oh my God, that can go so wrong. But if you say to anybody who's kind of in their late 20s or early 30s, I'm not sure bring your whole self to work is a great idea. They look at you like you've just killed their dog or something. It's like, like, what do you mean I can't bring my whole self to work? You're like, well, bring your professional self to work. But what
Hmm.
is this idea of like, yeah, making your colleagues your some sort of like family or something? And then they're finding it quite shocked now that people are getting made redundant, because they're like, why am I, what, I can't believe I got made redundant. I thought this was my family.
Yeah.
And, those of us who are a bit older were like, you didn't buy that, did you? I can't believe you
Yeah.
bought that.
Hmm.
So, and we started looking at corporations and employers to sort of have this sort of paternal sort of role, which I think that's a sort of parental kind of role, I suppose. Particularly young people needed it then for more like sort of pastoral care, which, we probably didn't need at that age. But now that we've had COVID as well, like an awful lot of stuff has happened over the last 10 years, really.
Definitely.
And, we know that young people aren't doing brilliantly. We know that university is clearly not equipping them for the world of work. So an awful lot of stuff is sort of falling on employers to pick up the slack there, I think.
Well, that's the other thing that's gone wrong. The whole population's been encouraged to go to university.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a mistake looking back. I mean, it was a mistake at the
Definitely.
time, actually. I mean, I wrote an article in 2010 for the Guardian about this. I said we need to work out what universities for before we keep sending all these people in. Of
Hmm.
course, no one listened, and we kept sending people in, and then we put the fees up. Um, so I think, yeah, a lot has gone wrong there, and it's like I found it really shocking to hear from employers of young people who are now saying we would rather have apprentices than graduates, because they're much more easygoing. They work harder. You retain them for much longer, and they just have a much better attitude. They
Yeah.
don't have the entitlement. And I'm like, oh my God, if that's true, why are we still sending anyone to university unless they want to be a doctor or a lawyer?
Exactly.
Can we stop giving young people
Yeah.
bad advice? This is
Yeah.
I don't like demonizing young people. You know, you know, young people are always a pain in the ass. I love them, but they're a pain in the ass. But they always have been. We were, and they are. And it's up to us to guide them in the right way,
Yeah.
and to kind of, kind of, what a better word, kind of knock them into shape once they start, well, working. And we all had to do that. So I think there's been a question of how much we can do that as an employer, how much we should do that. And I wonder if it would be helpful to get into being a little bit tougher.
Well, this is the thing. Running a business isn't easy. It's really difficult. But yet, like as an employer, you're expected to look after your staff in such a way as like helping them with like working out what they're going to do for childcare and getting to work and stuff in some senses. And then if they have problems outside, you're supposed to kind of the expectations kind of there for you to completely look after people. But
Yeah, I
actually,
mean,
what you need as an employer is someone who's going to come in and do what you need them to do
yeah, I think
on
we got
time.
confused because I think I mean, there is a role for some of the stuff in things like retention. So
Yeah,
if you don't have a decent, maternity policy, or you make it very difficult for people to, go and pick up their kids when they're ill during the middle of the day, or whatever, you're going to lose good people. So
definitely.
so there are definitely moments when this is just good. Does just make good business sense. And there are policies like, say, somebody's got, cancer diagnosis, or a parent who's very ill or something like that, and they're a great, they're a great employee. They need you to cut them some slack because they've got some stuff going on. That's something that you would deal with kind of with the manager, and you work it out together. I think where we've gone wrong is kind of getting into the details of everyone's lives, everyone's personal lives, when we just should never have got into that. And I think trying to educate everybody, seeing the workplace as a place to educate each other about our own niche interests or whatever, is just not the way to go. I mean, there's some interesting stuff about menopause and menstruation and stuff, which is all coming in as well. I mean, the menopause stuff really kicked off. I mean, Davina, whether you like Davina or you don't, that stuff was suddenly like really big. It's like, we need to give more accommodations to women of that sort of age. They're going through this stuff. Fine. Is it a health issue? Is it something you all need to talk about in the workplace? Do all women want to talk about this in the workplace? Do they want
No,
to talk about it with their male colleagues? I'm not
no.
convinced that they do. There was never any real discussion, and it's always the idea of like smashing taboos, that we should all be talking about this stuff. And suddenly, I don't know, it doesn't feel great to me either. But some women
No.
love this stuff, but some women don't love this stuff. And there wasn't any space to talk about the fact that there were differences of opinion here. And then with the menstruation stuff coming in as well, seen some crazy stuff about, we should all be having, lunch and learns about the menstrual cycle. And, of course, we've got to have the men in the room as well. I'm thinking,
That's my worst
it's
nightmare.
my worst nightmare too. But I mean, loads of women love this stuff. And I'm the one going, hang on a minute. And then,
I think
religious minorities,
if my
culture.
husband was asked to sit through that as well, he'd be mortified.
I know. I agree with you, but loads of women love this stuff, and they think that the taboo is the problem. But actually, so I went to a webinar all about that. It was a CIPD thing, and it was basically saying, we have to basically talk about this stuff more. And they were presenting this new data that they'd collected. But in fact, when you look at the data, they were saying, oh, women don't tell their manager when they're, not well enough to work because of their period or whatever. And the number one reason that they gave for not wanting to tell their manager why they were off sick was privacy and dignity.
Huh?
And I'm not sure how the CIPD had leapt from women saying, yeah, I've just said that I was ill, I didn't really want to get into it, to we must smash taboos. What women really mean when they say they don't want to talk about it is that they really want to talk about it loads. It was like, no, they literally
It's a
said they don't want to talk
massive
about
leap,
it
that. Yeah.
because then everyone's going to know, when's your time with them. I was like,
Yeah.
oh God,
Yeah.
is this really the answer? So all that sort of stuff has come in, and it's like, I mean, there might be some, and then we're talking about, endometriosis and PCOS at the same time, which are health conditions, and that should be in the kind of Crohn's, kind of camp for me, with, just a long-term health condition that you might need some time off every now and again. But that's not the same as, I don't know, we're in a
I
mess.
think if you're briefly mentioning it as a reason why somebody might have certain issues, then there's a context there. But if you're just raising awareness of all these conditions
Yeah.
and menstruation and menopause in the workplace, it doesn't fit for me. I feel uncomfortable about it.
And then it's like, if we're doing this if we were running a brilliant, doing a brilliant job of HR, and there were no employment tribunals and everything was going great, then maybe we can do we'll talk about the menstruation workshop. But since there's so much bread and butter stuff that seems to be going wrong, at the same time as you're seeing all of this stuff about kind of health and well-being is basically the new DEI, I don't think it's going to take off. Well, it kind of is already, but I don't think it will take off in the same way because, frankly, the budgets are all getting cut this year. So I think we might be saved by the fact that all these companies are going, actually, no, this is not essential. Show me the evidence, which is what they should have done with DEI because there isn't really any. Show me the evidence, or you haven't, or not giving you the money for that. Actually, on evidence, it's worth talking about. Because I mentioned how powerful No Debate was around the trans stuff, particularly. But there's a company called McKinsey, which is a big management consultancy. Some of your listeners might know. And McKinsey came out with 4 reports, I think between about let's say maybe 2015, 16 up to 2020, I think, maybe 2021, 22. These 4 reports, which are sort of supposed to show that demographic DEI, particularly race and sex, leads to better business outcomes. And this was supposed to be like the business case for DEI. And as it turns out, because I've interviewed experts on this stuff, that data is not only really flimsy, but actually doesn't really exist. So you've got this thing where, I think it does extend to the trans issue as well. This sort of McKinsey myth has come in that diversity is good for business, diversity is good for your team, even if you're not a profit-making business. It's good for productivity. It's not. There isn't any data for that. So at the same time as you've got No Debate, you've also got the McKinsey myth. And I still see people saying now, oh, but it is good for business because there's this McKinsey study. But McKinsey, which is a really well-regarded international consultancy, it's beginning to look, from what I am finding, like they have been pushing this idea, because once you've sold someone a problem, you can also sell them the solution, right?
Yeah.
And what do McKinsey do? They will come in and they will fix your diversity and all sorts of other stuff to do with your business that's not working. And I think what those reports are is apparently they are nowhere near robust enough to be considered anything near an academic study. They're basically marketing.
Yeah.
And the numbers don't work. And so you're cherry picking data. You're not comparing like with like. There's a bit of correlation, but no causation. In fact, it's not even clear there even is correlation. My maths is rubbish, but I can understand how you can manipulate data to show that something is good business when actually it's not.
Yeah.
The number of people who apparently just haven't read that properly. And that idea really, really took off, that diversity is good for business, because it sort of feels true. So all of these ideas are all sloshing around at the same time. And then you're beginning to see how people how it's quite easy to sell people any old nonsense at that point, because we're already believing a whole bunch of things that aren't right.
Yeah.
And it's just destabilized everybody, really.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a big mess, isn't it?
Mm.
So, has anything really surprised you?
Yeah, loads. Where to start? I mean, I think I'm really shocked about how bad diversity training is. The gender stuff, some of it is absolutely crackers. I mean, there was a woman who was doing sessions about transgender lions, intersex bears, and gender fluid orangutans. And I know. And she spoke at CIPD. And once she'd done that, she could do lots of other organizations too. And big firms. And it's like, how do we get to this point where we've got people going into big firms selling some frankly pretty kooky ideas? And how is no one scrutinized this person? How are they continuing to get work? And during the sessions, how do people feel like they can't stand up and go, sorry, this is absolute rubbish. Who are you? What are your credentials? What are you trying to sell us? Like, how did we get there? I mean, the training, and some of the training I've realized, because some of the ideas that they're selling are directly incompatible with the Equality Act. So, for example, if you go in and tell everybody that people who identify as trans are the most marginalized, vulnerable minority ever, you're sort of creating the idea in people's heads that there's a hierarchy of these protected characteristics. So I'm sure you know in the Equality Act in the UK, we have 9 different protected characteristics. And gender reassignment is one of them. But there's no hierarchy. So, race is one, sex is one, sexual orientation is another one. So, but if you've had trainers coming in for years telling everybody that the most marginalized, vulnerable people are anybody who identifies as trans, non-binary, gender fluid, or any of the above, you can kind of see how you're sort of undoing people's idea of what the Equality Act actually said, and you're confusing everybody and actually making everybody frankly stupider than they were when they went into the session. It's like, okay, so I guess I didn't really realize how some of those sort of kind of culture, kind of workplace culture people who say, oh, don't do the legal bit, they'll say cute, sort of cutesy way. But God, they've done a lot of damage, those people. They really have. That's been quite, I have been pretty shocked about that, to be honest. Yeah. I mean, I think, and here, I was listening to, the Melanie Newman Met Police case recently. And also, and, you know, I can see how these terrible trainers come in, and it's not helped with the trans stuff. It's really not helped by the LGBT staff groups, which tend to be pretty lively, and they're not very well supervised, if at all. And you can see how these groups that were supposed to be like nice little friendly networks can actually become quite nasty activist sort of cells. I don't think I'm being melodramatic, actually. I think that's pretty much what I heard being described. Because there just weren't enough guardrails around any of this stuff. There was no quality control. There was no due diligence, whether it's the training or the groups or any of the ideas in the first place. People's concept of the Equality Act also was not solid enough and was not being refreshed properly. Again, that's the CIPD have not been doing a good job of that. I think it looks to me like standards have completely collapsed. I mean, I had an HR director said to me that he thought that less than 10% of people in HR and DEI understand the Equality Act properly. Another HR director said to me last week that she had a CIPD qualified HR person who came in for an interview and couldn't name the 9 protected characteristics.
Goodness.
Nobody seems to know how to do a grievance procedure, because when there is a problem with this issue or any other issue, it looks like the HR team tend to immediately side with the person who they perceive to be the most vulnerable, according to their own politics and their own views. I've heard, like, one person said to me, we don't really bother to consult the lawyers because, they cost a fortune and they never give us a straight answer. So we just do what feels legal.
Dear.
So I was like, oh my God, how did we get here? And then I look at those cases and I think, oh, I know how we got here. And I think also, it's, when you look at something like, the Met Police case or the NHS 5 case, that's really, really extreme. You're not actually seeing that. There was an article by the lawyer Peter Daly recently. He was talking about you're not seeing private sector cases getting to employment tribunal anymore because they're settling out of court first. Because they probably realised, at some point they realised, oh my God, what have we done here?
This is a PR nightmare.
This is a PR nightmare, exactly. And also because there are some sensible people still there who very late in the day have gone, wait a second, no, we need to de-escalate. We need to pay this person off. We've clearly made a complete mess of this and we are not going to court. I think what you're seeing in some of the public sector places, and I know there are some charities behaving pretty badly as well, is that if there were any sensible people, they've left. Yeah. And what you're left with is the people that are really, really into some of this stuff. And they are prepared to spend taxpayers' money going to court. They are so into this stuff. They are so convinced that they have correctly identified who the most marginalized person is, that they are prepared to go to court for it. And that's why you're seeing what you're seeing. I don't think you're going to see that in the private sector probably ever again. I think that's done. I really do.
At least that's something.
Yeah, I think the corporate sector is really interesting. I think it will lead because it's got the profit driver. And I actually think that the whole of DEI was more like an aberration because you've got a much better social mix of people. You always did. So funnily enough, they were always better on sort of social mobility. And, plenty of people voted for Brexit who work at these banks. Of course they did. Lots of Tories, decent mix of people. There's the sales boys, there's the PAs. You've just got a much better mix of people. And they're not terribly sort of academic, and they're not terribly, earnest. They're not, they get their status from being successful, but not from being kind, particularly. They're actually they're an interesting bunch in that way. And they're not bogged down with the stuff that hasn't caught them in quite the same way. Obviously the DEI people and the HR people and the marketing people are more likely to have those kind of progressive activist types within them. But the rest of the firm was probably never that into it, to be honest. And so it's going to be that much easier, I think, for them to try and kind of quietly get rid of it. I'm not sure if they can succeed, but it's going to be easier than getting it out of, I think the public sector's in trouble.
Yeah.
I think the charity sector is in big trouble.
Yeah.
And I think the arts, I know Rosie Kay quite well. And usually I'm like, well, it's always me bringing the good news and her bringing the bad news. Because, they've really got, I read a brilliant article by her today in the Evening Standard about the state of the Tate, galleries, and how they've got into just completely not realizing that, it's not about pushing the agenda of the people that run the gallery. Like, no one cares. People want to see art that moves them and makes sense and interesting and, kind of, stimulating. People don't want to see you pushing your politics by the, they're not interested in the curator's politics. Like, who do you think you are? And people aren't going to stuff anymore. So I think it has a really, really big impact. The HR director that I talked to originally back in, was it September? It's a really good guy called Neil Morrison from Severn Trent, the water company. He was, I was sort of saying, oh, Neil, I think we've made a mess of this DEI stuff. And he was like, well, yeah, but it's not that big a deal, we'll just quietly unpick it. And then since then, I've seen, obviously, Trump, but things like people saying it's played a role in things like the grooming gangs and the LA fires and that, that terrible plane crash in America. The pilot might have been a DEI hire or whatever. And I just think, oh my God, there actually are real world consequences to this.
Yeah.
On top of the employment tribunals. But in America, the law's a bit different in America. So, what they call affirmative action, we never had in the UK. We would call that positive discrimination. So you can't give someone a job because they're black or because they're a woman any more than you can give them a job because they're white or because they're a man. Yeah. What you can do is something called positive action, which is kind of more like leveling the playing field in ways, giving them extra kind of training or extra support, whatever. Probably not training, but up to the point of selection. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit different in the UK, but what we've been doing is bending the rules and getting too close to the line between positive action and positive discrimination. And I think we have been doing that, particularly at senior levels. They've certainly been hiring people, who they shouldn't have been hiring, and they're probably okay.
Yeah,
they're probably okay, but they're not necessarily the best person. But that's really terrible because it means that, if anybody is a minority or they're a woman, then there's this horrible kind of suspicion around maybe you were a DEI hire, which is such a horrible phrase. It's like, they shouldn't have to have that kind of suspicion hanging around them just because we made such a mess of this by executing it so badly.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It does horrify me when I look at what's happening in the voluntary sector. Not just the way the things that you've talked about hiring and stuff, but the way the funding is as well. Like, everything's around LGBTQ plus whatever, and it's all about, well, all the things that I see, it's all propaganda. And it's horrifying because charities are there to help vulnerable people who are, that it's like the last safeguard on vulnerable people, isn't it, before they really hit rock bottom.
Yeah. I think, also in most organizations, we seem to have got to a point where we are punishing courage and rewarding cowardice.
Yeah.
And that can't be good, and any dissent or questions that anybody has are quite often framed as negativity. And I always had a problem with the idea that you can't raise that you think you found a problem with something unless you've also got a solution to it. I'm the kind of person who's really good at seeing problems. I have called my podcast "This Isn't Working." I am very good at seeing when something isn't working.
That's why I don't work in the voluntary sector anymore.
Right. It's also my job to come up with a solution. And if you're telling me that I can't verbalize the problem, I can't talk about the iceberg I can see on the horizon, unless I've also got a solution and can package it and sell it in a way that everyone's going to love. These are the people that spot the problems are quite a different type of person to the people that got the solutions. So maybe we can all talk about the solutions. I've got the problem. Let's all find a solution together.
Yeah.
I think
this is the thing. I just don't think they wanted to see the problem, so therefore the solution wasn't needed either. So.
But it also went wrong when we stopped talking about problems. We started talking about challenges and solutions. Did you notice that?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, so now we can't even voice. We've got to call it a challenge to make it fun. It's like, oh my God. So I don't know. I think we've kind of lost our way in so many different ways. I think, as I say, that the corporate world is interesting because they've got the profit driver. So I think they are the ones to watch, and whatever they do, will have an impact on everybody eventually. And what's happened with Trump, you might not quite be able to join the dots yet, but what's happening is that Trump has basically said to all the law firms, including the UK branches of the law firms, that he won't work with them unless they get anything that looks like positive discrimination, out of their businesses. So that's really squeezing them. And you're seeing all of those DEI people are leaving. And once they start leaving the bank, it happens to the banks, and then there's a whole stink around DEI, and that will all trickle down. And once the corporate world dumps it, I think that changes things quite significantly, I think, for everybody.
And he's also turned off the funding that's funding all this stuff, hasn't he? So that's hopefully
And it's
going to have a
made it,
positive impact.
and it's made it kind of acceptable for people to sort of say, well, if the president of the United States can say there's only two sexes, then why can't we say that at work? Like, he's just kind of taken that shock factor out of it a bit, which I think is really good. I mean, I've still got a lot of questions, to be honest. I mean, I'm going to keep digging until I find the answers, I promise. One of my questions is, why does no one in HR know who Sandy Peggy is? Still, where is that disconnect happening? Are the law firms doing their job? The lawyers love to blame everyone else, is one thing I've discovered. But excuse me, whose job is it to make sure that your client knows that there's a huge risk here in their organization? And did you check their policy before they put all these, all this kind of Stonewall law into it?
Absolutely.
Like, I'm starting to think that the lawyers want the clients to make mistakes so that they can charge them a fortune to correct their mistakes. That's my working theory at the moment. So I think capitalism will ultimately win. That's there are moments when I think, God, how are they going to fix this?
Yeah, it's so huge, isn't it?
But I believe in capitalism. I don't know if I particularly have ideological feelings about this, but we know that making money is just the biggest driver for these organizations anyway. And so they will always find ways to make money. I know that. So it's like so capitalism will win, but I'm not quite sure how, when organizations can't yet talk openly about what's gone so wrong. I think big organizations are very controlling about what their staff put on social media, what they can talk about on podcasts, what they can talk about on a panel event at a conference. So I think we've, in a way, kind of impoverished industry debate.
Yeah.
By telling people, you can only talk about the successes of this organization. You can't say, we really messed this up, or even analyze everyone else's mess up. So, for example, in advertising, there should be discussions about what the hell happened, with that Jaguar thing.
That was terrible.
You really want to see proper analysis of, was this a mistake? I don't, maybe they are having it. I doubt it. No. I really doubt it, but you need proper analysis of, like, how did this go wrong? And even when there's a big case, thinking about the case with the RAF a couple of years ago, really screwed up their recruitment thing, and they're basically doing positive discrimination because they limited their funnel of applicants to only people from minority ethnic backgrounds. So basically meant that you couldn't be white and get this job in the end, because you had to go through a training scheme which was only open to people from minorities. So that was found to be unlawful. There should have been so much conversation about that. That was such a screw up. How did that happen? Whose decision was that? How do we make sure that doesn't happen again? Are we sure that we're getting everything legal before we do it? Has something gone wrong? Like, did they consult the lawyers? I don't even know how that.
Why would you want to do that, though? You're narrowing your talent pool.
Yeah,
it doesn't make business sense.
They wanted to hit their targets. You see that, and this is all the unintended consequences of we don't have quotas in the UK, apart from the Scottish public boards where they have gender quotas. But other than that, we don't have any quotas. We have targets, right? But a target, which is like just an ambition. It's a dream. It's a goal, but it's not. It's not set in stone. But if you tie people's bonuses to reaching those targets, what do you think will happen? They will do everything they can to reach those targets, and then it looks like a quota, right? So you see them bending the rules and lowering standards a little bit here and there, or let's take out that question from the the assessment, because women don't tend to answer that question very well, so let's take it out. You can just sort of see how it happens, and you end up with all these weird consequences where you've just lost the plot completely.
Do you have any solutions?
I don't think that the CIPD is part of the solution. I think we need to get rid of the HR industry body. I think it will collapse anyway later this year for various reasons. But it's a bit like Stonewall or WPath. It's the incumbent that wants to present itself as the sort of gatekeeper, but it has in fact failed. And it is now just blocking everybody from moving forward. So I think that will collapse later this year. I would put money on that. There's a few things coming down the pipe. The chief exec, I think, will have to leave, which would be a good thing. I think we need to open up the space for employers to be able to debate properly and discuss things. We've been too dependent on the industry press. They have failed. We're too dependent on the CIPD. That has failed. But I think there's actually a really lively market of people that want to talk about this stuff. There are training providers who are really good. There's people like me doing interesting editorial. I'd love to do that bit of it. I don't want to run, a new CIPD. Do we even need it? It's not doing anything anyway. If it's supposed to be setting the standards, but the standards are crap, frankly, then what is it doing? And are we going to miss it? So I think that's definitely, I think that needs to go. And I would like to see a healthier, more lively market return. There's plenty of money to be made in HR and recruitment and all these sorts of things, L&D, all these sorts of things. There's a lot of money to be made. So plenty of people will move into that space. I just think you need to move the CIPD out. I think it has failed. I think until they fix it, I think employers are going to continue to lose good people until they sort it out. And I think I'm worried about their employer brand as well. How people think of you as an employer is really, really important if you work in recruitment, right? So they spend a lot of money on this thing called employer brand. And it sounds a bit niche, and things like the NHS, I look at the NHS and I'm like, oh my God, another case with another nurse who's been treated horribly badly in the hospital where she works. What message is this sending to new talent that might want to go into nursing?
Absolutely.
It is a disaster.
And that's another question I was thinking of, you might have a response to. Do you have any advice for an employee who's facing these kinds of issues?
Well, I would send your HR people links to my podcast and make clear that actually these conversations are opening up now. And I would say, look, this is complicated stuff and a range of views are available on all this stuff. People have been well intentioned, but stuff is more complicated than we originally realized. And now that we're aware of that, we need to go back and reassess whether we've got the balance right. I would say it is easier there are ways to have those conversations in exactly the sort of way that I just expressed, rather than saying, I think this is absolute nonsense and really offensive. I mean, people can express themselves as they wish, but there is another way through it, which is what I've been doing on LinkedIn for the last 2.5 years, really, which is saying, okay, it's not about my own personal views on this stuff. The fact is, we need to consider everybody that works here, and we need to consider what's in the best interests of this organization, retaining all of these people. And if you're going to really offend them with all this training that they don't agree with, they're going to be a flight risk. We need to do what's best for the organization. And if you present it in that way, you're on much steadier ground. You will still get people saying you're not being kind or whatever. But if you stick to, well, yes, I'm also concerned because I've seen this case recently, which has got this employer in trouble. And I think we need to be really careful about this. Are we absolutely sure that our policy is right on this? Did we get this legal properly? Should we go back and look at it again? I think there's a few things in it that aren't quite right. That becomes harder to argue with. I'm not saying it's easy. Of course, it's not easy. But I think depersonalizing it is really helpful, and putting the organization first. And if you are an HR person saying, I'm worried about employer brand, I'm worried about retention, I'm worried about productivity. I've seen a lot more middle-aged women either leaving the workforce or working from home because they've still got their job, but they just don't love it anymore.
Yeah.
They hate going into the office because it's all of this stuff that they're not into, and they feel out of place, and everybody makes them feel like a dinosaur. Like, you're losing a lot of talent there. I mean, I continue, there's this sort of go woke, go broke idea, which is it's a brilliant phrase for things like Bud Light, with their disastrous partnership with Dylan Mulvaney, the trans influencer. But it's helpful for that kind of consumer aspect of it. And I think consumers have already made clear that they don't love a lot of this stuff, and that's fair enough. But I actually think the biggest self-inflicted wound that employers, have managed to inflict on themselves here has been to their own organization from the inside, in terms of talent and culture. And if you've got rid of all your critical thinkers, or you've shamed them or silenced them, or they've left, you're left with the sort of nodding dogs who have switched their brains off, or they've just shut up because they just can't be bothered anymore. Is your organization in good shape for the challenges all coming down the track now? The problems with AI,
Definitely not.
Geopolitical uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
We've got so much stuff going on. And have you just got rid of all your best people? You turn around and go, where are all the good people? This used to be a great company, and now it's not. Well, why do you think that is? And they've sort of slowly left. So I am concerned about that. I think, and you can see some organizations that have gone so into this stuff. I don't think there's anybody left who can say, we got this wrong. I don't know how they're going to admit they got it wrong. I'm trying to work out whether it would be a brilliant marketing for somebody to say, we've really screwed this up, really publicly, we really screwed this up. We took everything at face value with all of this stuff, and we didn't think it through. And now we're changing, and this is what we're doing.
I can't see anyone doing that. They're just going to
More
quietly get rid of it, aren't they?
Yeah, it might be like a small brand, I think, who might do it. It might be like a small brand who might be like, well, let's do it. You know what I mean? I just think somebody might do it and say, we need to get this right. We need to think of everybody, but we also need to not, this is divisive stuff. Everyone's screaming at each other. We've got these employment tribunals. People aren't getting on. We're losing good people. This is bad.
Keeping people on speaking terms in the workplace is a challenge under normal conditions, for want of a better way of putting it. But introducing this stuff as well is just like,
yeah.
I nearly said dynamite, but I'm not sure if dynamite's the right word.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting in different industries. So I'm doing sort of deep dives into various different industries. I've done advertising, I've done the civil service, because I think depending on the nature of your industry, something different will pull you out of it. Whatever you had different, your industry was vulnerable in different ways than other industries, and therefore the way into it was different, and the way out is also different. And so, for example, the civil service versus advertising versus the police versus health, these are really different industries. Having talked to some of the people from some of the scene networks, if you meet some of these people all in a row or all together at something, it's like, oh, wow, you're all saying similar stuff, but it actually is a bit different. The police is interesting because I think that's much more naked misogyny, actually. Whereas in publishing, it's like nicey, kind, sort of status stuff. I mean, you could say it's all the same. It's all the same thing, just dressed up in different packaging. But, depending on the business model as well. So, how it went wrong. So within advertising, for example, the relationship between the client and the agency was getting a bit rotten anyway. And then this stuff came in, and the big clients, like, Unilever and people said, we will only work with advertising agencies that also sign up to all this DEI stuff. So of course the agencies all kind of, jumped to it because they wanted to keep the clients. So that's just one example of like how the structure of the industry, how digital technologies come in, funding squeezes, whatever it would be. Gosh, I find it fascinating. I mean, I know you're interested in it as well.
Yeah,
So
it's really fascinating.
I'm going to keep digging until I find some answers. I promise. I've got some good guests coming up. I thought you're going to like them.
Yeah.
Honestly, because the trans thing is a really good example of like,
because
people
say things about trans like, well, it's a minority of people. Why are you so obsessed? But it's so fundamental to society and who we are, and women's rights and safeguarding children. And women are 51% of the population, and we don't deserve to be treated like this.
Yeah, I think in the cold light of day, which I think is beginning to dawn anyway, I have to say, stuff that was weird at the time is going to look even weirder, in the next 6 months to a year. I mean, certainly. And I think you're going to have a real obvious difference between the corporate world and then the universities and the arts. And I already get whiplash depending on who I'm talking to. Wait, where are you? I was like, are you still in 2019? Oh, you're in 2019. Okay. I'm in 2025, and how taboo all this stuff is in loads of industries. I know it's really taboo, but I think we can't lead from the middle. I think we need to lead from the front. And by that, I mean, I'm leading in terms of bringing back different perspectives. Don't, mention my own views on any of this stuff. I try to avoid that. It's probably pretty obvious where you might put me, but you have to lead from the front in terms of saying we need to bring back the proper discussion, robust discussion, proper debate. The era of no debate is done. So given that's the case, let's start talking. And I think I'm quite good at facilitating those conversations. So that's the bit that I want to do. And I will keep doing that, I promise, till I find more answers. I can come back on again when I've got some more answers.
Yeah, I really love watching you on LinkedIn. Just the back and forth with some of the people who don't agree with you.
I know someone said I was like a street fighter. I'm like, is that good? Yeah, but there are ways to say, oh, this is really interesting. How exactly does this fit with the Equality Act?
Yeah, exactly. That's
Have you
what's
considered everyone
interesting, because I've not seen it in that context until I connected with like you and some other women who are doing the same.
And lots of heads of DEI who are just presenting their own personal politics as if it's what everyone thinks. I mean, they all are really anti-Trump. And it's like, fine, they can be anti-Trump, but you're supposed to be the head of DEI at a big organization. Some people in your organization will like Trump, or at least like some of the stuff that Trump does. So I don't know what you think you're doing. Why are you the only person in your organization that is allowed to write all this political stuff? Because no one else is. Yeah. It's only the DEI people. And they should be the last people that should be doing that stuff.
Yeah.
Really, because what message does it send to everyone else?
And when you think something doesn't sound like because they don't understand what Trump's about, most people who oppose him. So I've started asking the question, well, what is it that I don't know? If this doesn't sound right, what do I not know about it?
Yeah, but they're very open about their views on, Kemi Badenoch and J.K. Rowling and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, are you guys sure that you're in the majority here? Quite a lot of people actually like these people.
Yeah.
But it's the echo chamber effect. That's probably an answer to your early question about what's shocked me. The echo chamber effect is really very, very
it's algorithms,
frightening.
Isn't it?
But also, people love the algorithms. I mean, people love the echo chamber. The algorithms keep them safe. At some point, when I'm in an echo chamber, I go, I feel like I'm not getting the full story. And I venture out because I want to get out of that, which I think a lot of people do as well. But some people don't want to be challenged. That thing doesn't kick in that makes them think, what am I missing? So they don't think to get outside of the echo chamber. They like the bubble. They want to stay in the bubble because it's cozy.
Yeah.
I think they should be worried about their jobs.
Definitely. Yeah. So, Tanya, thank you so much for coming on. If the viewers would like to find you, where's the best place to look you up?
Probably YouTube. This isn't working.
Okay.
It's the name of the podcast, and I'm at Isn't Working Pod on Twitter.
Okay, and I will put your links in the show notes so that people can just click on them.
And if you're a LinkedIn person, I'm on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah.
You'll find me in the trenches.
Yeah, there's some
probably
very robust discussion on there.
Arguing with some crazies at like 1 a.m. But, it's good to have a hobby. Thank you so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.